Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Manhattan. It is good to be here together this morning. I'm Pastor Isabel Call, and it is such a joy to serve as the minister here at UUFM. Our mission is to be a diverse, evolving spiritual community acting for a better world. That is what we are living into here together. I want to just start our service off by inviting you to bring your whole selves here. And if there is a joy or sorrow alive for you this week that you'd like for everybody to know about, that is welcome here. If you're here in person, you can start to write it down now. There's a paper in one of the bamboo boxes near you. And if you're on Zoom, you can type it into the chat later. I'll let you know when the time comes. Welcome visitors and newcomers. Our greeter, Jessica, is especially available to answer questions. And if you're here on Zoom, Kathy Swenson is available. Our service today is focused on our history as a faith community, particularly in the Midwest and what was called the frontier, the edge. We pause now to acknowledge that this land was not the edge of civilization. When white people arrived, it was the homeland, the heartland for the Kanza people and others who moved freely and lived in right relationship with the land. So we acknowledge that the first governor of the state of Kansas, Charles Robinson, who was a Unitarian, actually, among others, in seeking to colonize Kansas as the Eden of the world, caused incalculable harm to indigenous people. We commit to learning more about these roots and divesting from harm. Heaven on earth, our theme this month, must be decolonized. Our reading is from the introduction to the book Prophetic Sisterhood, Liberal Women Ministers of the Frontier by Cynthia Grant Tucker.
In the latter half of the 1800s, Universalist and Unitarian women were inspired by their church teachings to insist on being ordained. The Universalists, who maintained that salvation was open to all, had a loose institutional structure and a tradition of experimentation that relaxed the historical strictures on women and gave them more latitude in public service. The first American woman to be ordained was our Universalist ancestor, Olympia Brown. The Unitarians, meanwhile, had a strong commitment to freedom of thought, stressed education, and insisted on a rational reading of the scripture. Rejecting original sin, they absolved Eve of having corrupted the race. Discarding the Trinity and placing Jesus on an entirely human plane, they allowed for a more androgynous concept of deity.
There was still strong underlying and overt misogyny. The number of women who had the interest and nerve to take on the opposition and prove themselves in pastorates was a minuscule cluster that seemed like a great gathering only to the women themselves when their hopes got the better of them. By 1890, the Universalists and Unitarians together had ordained only about 70 women, and far fewer actually had a chance to use their credentials in full-time paid pastorates. Called to only small or shakier congregations that the men would not take, or married to male ministers whose position obscured or reduced their own, and regarded poorly by denominational leadership, the women in ministry were a largely unnoticed presence. Their existence came to be known, primarily through the efforts of 20 or so Unitarian women who banded together on the frontier in the 1880s and 1890s. This group, which came to be known as the Iowa Sisterhood, was held together for half a century by a webbing of common ideals and shared history.
It was no accident that this sisterhood should emerge in Iowa and the states surrounding it, rather than the East, the Mecca of Unitarianism. For the colonists who had come to the Great Plains to start new lives from scratch were less bound to the old ways of doing things. They brought their states into the Union with new sets of ground rules, laws that gave females unprecedented domestic rights and political voice. And as men were in chronically short supply, the women were also given a chance to break out of old roles and enter professions. When few men stepped forward to take on the grueling and low-paying job of organizing and tending new congregations in the West, the women moved in and took command of denominational growth for 2 decades.
They did ministry differently than male ministers back east, enunciating the ideals and practical needs of family and home. The women's androgynous blend of business management, sound preaching, and maternal caregiving met the distinctive demands of those who broke with the Orthodox Church out here in the West. Not only did frontier parishioners face the problems of poverty, sickness, and climate, but they were regarded as heretics of the worst kind by their Orthodox neighbors, the Presbyterians, the Methodists, Baptists, and Calvinist Congregationalists. Non-Trinitarians were ostracized and persecuted. They were made the object of scorn at public revivals and had their businesses boycotted. What they longed for was not academic orators, but sympathetic ministers with an optimistic faith to enfold them in tight, supportive communities and lighten their everyday load.
Like their 19th century sisters who blazed the trails and tried to clear the brush for them, women pastors today reaffirm the importance of women's traditional work while being free of the notion that only women can do it, and seek to return ministry to its domestic imperatives of building church families, making good homes for them, and preaching a practical gospel of neighborliness. Their inclination is towards a more circular rather than top-down management style, recognizing as equally vital the pastorates of all their members, whether they chair the church board or bake the cakes that pay for the pews. They encourage more congregational ministry, more lay presence in the pulpit, peer support groups, and intergenerational services. This return to the old meaning of the church home comes as a timely corrective to the growing consumer mentality that wants its religion catered.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan. Primer, a definition. An elementary text designed to introduce people to a topic. The Sunday Services team felt that we could use a UU history primer. And months ago when we planned this service, I knew it would be straightforward to connect it to our monthly theme, Heaven on Earth. Everything I've studied about Unitarian Universalist and Unitarian Universalist history points to heaven on earth as our vision for humanity. Our ancestors were certain that there is no God who condemns anyone to eternal hell, but humans are quite capable of making hell here on earth. We are also capable of doing our part to create beautiful, loving communities that embody our ideals. Heaven is a good shorthand for what we're aiming for, but let's not wait till we're dead. Primer can also be defined as a preparatory coat of paint to make more beauty possible. Preparing my reflections is a spiritual practice for me. I allow it to teach me, to prepare me for the next week of my life and ministry, the next work of art that life and ministry will paint onto my soul. The timing shook out for this to be my last service before starting treatment for breast cancer, a disease that affects people of all genders, but more often women. I chose the healing stories of powerful women to prime me and us for the ministry ahead. During my preparations, I had an amazing opportunity to work with 5 other Kansas religious women on a short film we are provisionally titling Religious Voices for Democracy and Kindness. 3 months of weekly planning lunches finally culminated in several hours at the Washburn University TV studio last Tuesday. Under bright lights and the watchful gaze of a young woman behind 2 different cameras, we talked about what it means to be a Kansan, what it means to be a powerful woman, and how our faith traditions support democracy. Then we went out to dinner. At the tail end of the meal, Pastor Lori Lewis from First Christian Church set down her fork and asked, "How is everyone doing?" And then she looked right at me before anyone else could answer and said, "How are you doing, Isabel?" The group has been supportive of me since I first received my diagnosis, but last Tuesday, it was time to get down to brass tacks. Lori organized us into making plans for meals, thinking about the specific mobility impairments I'll have after surgery, finding loans for some essential items. I woke up the next morning with a clear to-do list for the last preparations, and because of their support, more motivation to do it than I'd had since my diagnosis. It was a day in the life of women ministers, an androgynous blend of business management, sound preaching, and maternal caregiving for the modern era. I am well served by this ministry from my peers. And my work here with UUFM is to serve you in this way and amplify this congregation's unique, androgynous, powerful, democratic, Kansan ministry. Our institutional roots, UUFM, don't go back as far as the Iowa Sisterhood. But since the late 1950s, we have claimed our Unitarian Universalist identity, and so we can tap into their stories and claim them as our own. And I believe that we're made of the same stuff. Their approach to ministry sustained a vulnerable minority of free-thinking people of faith and ultimately revolutionized church in ways that affected the very Presbyterians, Methodists, Congregationalists, and even Baptist institutions that were scorning the free thinkers. Our religious ancestors broke rules by embracing women ministers. In this generation, when women ministers make up the majority of UU ministers, what other rules are we breaking that will change everything? What is our version of sisterhood? A version that can be embraced by people of all generations and all genders. Many of those in the Iowa sisterhood had been friends since childhood back east, heeding the call to ministry by braving the extreme loneliness and isolation of serving Western churches. They sustained their friendships over miles of rugged road, uncertain mail, and no doubt fervent prayer. If they could do that, then we could do anything. The story of the Iowa sisterhood has an ambiguous ending, not entirely happy. Of course, no story, actually truly ends. They all live on. But I'll read again from Cynthia Grant Tucker's book, which closes the story in the 1930s. She writes, as the 19th century drew to a close, the sisterhood watched the reassertion of male authority in the culture at large. The Unitarian leadership, thinking that it should build a manlier ministry, strengthened its central office in Boston and did its best to dislodge female clergy while blocking others from joining them. While these pastors blamed sexist bias for the most for their exodus, they knew that their congregation's indifference to what they were preaching was also a factor. Sensitized to the need for reform by their own oppression as women, these preachers had become increasingly outspoken, calling for radical changes in the structures of businesses and government and trying to rouse their people to get involved. They watched the younger generations, whose greater distance from Calvinism made them more casual about their liberal faith, defect to fashionable mainline churches where the Orthodox teachings had softened. Frustrated by the laity's failure to take their sermons to heart and weary of being anathematized by an institution that wanted them out, the clergywomen reluctantly shifted their ministry to the secular fields of settlement work, municipal housekeeping, suffrage, and world peace. As residents of social settlements and as public health reformers, they carried the principle of the domestic ministry one step farther by trying to make society a better home for the larger family out in the community. As leaders of suffrage campaigns and as workers for peace during World War I, they evangelized for the same ideals of democracy, freedom, and balance in human relations that they had consistently preached from their pulpits. Does this story feel relevant today? The example of the Central Unitarian administration being misogynist and authoritarian, in complete violation of both its inclusive theology and non-hierarchical polity, warns us that we can't just assume that the good guys we've been looking up to are good guys or are acting like good guys. But no matter what's going on up top, the nail in the coffin will be at the local level. Probably any organized group of people can become stagnant as people shift from being pioneers to being settled, when they get comfortable and no longer need to fight for their principles. Institutions don't usually keep up with the times, and so new generations find other flashier settings where they can get their need for community met. Radical folks whose values line up with the initial intention of the group leave, or they don't join because they're not supported ideologically, or they can't stomach the hypocrisy. It's a story that can be told about all kinds of groups, political parties, perhaps, congregations, educational institutions. Maybe, to some extent, it's inevitable. Not that misogyny kicks out all the women leaders. I'm not going to entertain that as inevitable. But maybe it's inevitable there are cycles in groups. The prophetic sisterhood came, they did good work, and then they went out into the larger community to carry that work with them. Creating heaven on earth is not a tidy, one-time fix. We do it again and again and again, one generation at a time. A third definition of primer is a small pump for the initial buzz of fuel into an internal combustion engine. What is your prophetic sisterhood? How does your generation network to do amazing things? How can we nourish the next wave, the next sisterhood? One of the main things we'll be doing in this church year is envisioning the future shape of our religious education program. How do we prime the pump for new groups of pioneers to go out, break rules, and spread joy? I feel extremely lucky for our ancestors, those who have come before us, and to be here now to get to answer these questions with you. We'll close the service today with a hymn written about the all-gender sisterhood, you could call it, of Unitarians and Universalists. As early as the 1840s, it seemed obvious that the two faiths might be after the same heaven on earth. The first local merger of a Unitarian and a Universalist church was in Mukwonago, Wisconsin in 1878. They started happening all over the country. Around the country, ministers swapped pulpits between these two faiths, especially women ministers. The hymn we will be singing was written for a 1933 hymnal, which was intended to be shared by both faiths. 4 years later, the Unitarians developed a religious education curriculum for kids that was adopted also by the Universalists and actually a number of other faiths. In 1953, two national youth organizations, the Unitarian one and the Universalist one, joined. They sort of led the way for the 1961 merger or consolidation, which led to our Unitarian Universalist Association. Those assembled at that 1961 vote to consolidate will sing the hymn that we're about to sing together. So let us sing it in honor of all the diverse sisterhoods, I'm using that term expansively, who have brought us here and who will carry us into the future. This is hymn 145, As Tranquil Streams, and you're welcome to rise